All right, welcome back to Daily Read Aloud. We are in the middle of Frindle. We have had a few chapters so far. Nick Allen is our main character, and someone describe his characteristics real quick. Hayden, what's he like?
He's a little weird.
Okay, a little weird. I need more than that. A little weird means what, Noah?
He's like not a troublemaker, but he's a really good imagination.
Okay, he kind of likes to stir things up, right? He likes to pull off funny pranks. He's not really a mean kid, but he does like to do clever pranks. Emma?
He's clever, creative.
Good.
Kind, and made up a word.
Okay, that's what you're getting to.
As a pen.
Okay, so he just made up the word Frindle. When did he first say the word Frindle? Who remembers? Josiah?
When he was thinking about the pen that they found, and then he started going to that shop, and they started saying Frindle.
Okay,
and
good.
Eventually, the woman knew what it is.
Yep, so he and Janet were walking. Janet's in his class. She found a pen, or he found a pen. I don't know. She dropped it. He says, here's your Frindle. And she was like, oh. So then he and 6 other kids, they are going to this little shop, and they are all asking for a Frindle. And at this point, after 6 kids went in and asked for a Frindle, the woman didn't even ask what it meant. She just went and grabbed one and handed it. So is the word starting to catch on at least a little bit? Yeah. All right. All right. So the very last thing, they had a secret meeting, and they all had to raise their right hand and repeat after Nick. And they said, from this day on and forever, I will never use the word pen again. Instead, I will use the word Frindle, and I will do everything possible so others will too. And all 6 of them signed the oath with Nick's Frindle. The plan would work. Thanks, Mrs. Granger. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay, face the front. Word Wars. Chapter 7. School was the perfect place to launch a new word. And since this was a major historical event, Nick wanted to begin in exactly the right class. 7th period, Language Arts. Nick raised his hand first thing after the bell rang and said, Mrs. Granger, I forgot my Frindle. Sitting 3 rows away, John blurted out, I have an extra one you can borrow, Nick. Then John made a big show of looking for something in his backpack. I think I have an extra Frindle. I told my mom to get me 3 or 4. I'm sure I had an extra Frindle in here yesterday, but I must have taken it. Wait. Oh yeah, here it is. And then John made a big show of throwing it over to Nick, and Nick missed it on purpose. Then he made a big show of finding it. Mrs. Granger and every kid in the class got the message loud and clear. That black plastic thing that Nick borrowed from John had a funny name, a different name, a new name, Frindle. There was a lot of giggling, but Mrs. Granger turned up the power in her eyes and swept the room into silence. And the rest of the class went by according to plan, her plan. As everyone was leaving after class, Mrs. Granger said, Nicholas, I'd like to have a word with you. And she emphasized the word. Nick's mouth felt dry and he gulped, but his mind stayed clear. He walked up to her desk. Yes, Mrs. Granger? It's a funny idea, Nicholas, but I will not have my class disrupted again. Is that clear? Her eyes were lit up, but it was mostly light, not much heat. Idea? What idea? Asked Nick, and he tried to make his eyes as blank as possible. You know what I mean, Nicholas. I am talking about the performance that you and John gave at the start of class. I am talking about this. And she held up her pen, an old maroon fountain pen with a blue cap. But I really didn't have a Frindle with me, said Nick, amazed at his own bravery. And hiding behind his glasses, Nick kept his eyes wide and blank. Mrs. Granger's eyes flashed and then narrowed, and her lips formed a thin, hard line. She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said, I see. Very well. Then I guess we will have nothing more to discuss today, Nicholas. You may go. Thanks, Mrs. Granger, said Nick, and he grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. And when he just stepped into the hallway, he said, and I promise I won't ever forget my Frindle again. Bye. Ooh, he's brave. Chapter 8, Mightier Than the Sword. 2 days later, the photographer came to take class pictures. The 5th grade picture would be taken last, right after lunch. That gave Nick and his secret agents plenty of time, and they whispered something into the ear of every fifth grader. All the individual pictures had been taken, and finally, it was time for the group picture. Everyone was lined up on the auditorium stage, everyone's hair looked great, and everyone was smiling. But when the photographer said, "Say cheese," no one did. Instead, every kid said, "Frindle," and they held one up for the camera to see. The photographer was out of film, so that shot was the only fifth grade group picture he took. 6 of the fifth grade teachers were not pleased, and Mrs. Granger was furious. No one had really wanted to make the teachers mad. It was just fun. It also got all the kids in school talking about the new word. And when people pick up a new word, they say it all the time. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School liked Nick's word a lot, but not Mrs. Granger. The day after the class picture, she made an announcement to each of her classes, and she posted a notice on the main bulletin board by the office. Anyone who was heard using the word Frindle instead of the word pen will stay after school and write this sentence 100 times. "I am writing this punishment with a pen. Mrs. Granger." Hudson?
What does film mean?
So if you're taking pictures like in an old camera, you only have a certain amount of film. So if you use up all the film spots, you have to get it developed or put a new film inside. So it's an old thing. Now we have digital cameras. It'd be like if your memory card was full and you couldn't delete something, you had no more space. Hayden?
I have no more film for my camera.
Mm-hmm. Actually, now with Polaroid pictures, you guys kind of know Polaroid cameras. If you run out of the film inside, you can't take any more shots, right? Emma?
I think they're gonna continue to use the word Frindle, and when they get told to write a sentence, they're gonna say Frindle instead of pen.
We will see. That'd be awfully risky. Angie?
How would you feel if the class was if our class was taking a photo and we were in 5th grade and you were our teacher and instead of saying she said Frindle?
Do you think I'd get as mad as Mrs. Granger?
No.
Definitely.
I would not.
He made a new word.
That would be kind of fun. All right, Madeline, last comment we got to read on.
Maybe they'll whisper at each other instead.
True. Okay. So she just posted her notice, and if you do that again, you will stay after school and write 100 times. I am writing this punishment with a pen. But that just made everyone want to use Nick's word even more. Staying after school with the lone Granger became a badge of honor. There were kids in her classroom every day after school. It went on like that for a couple of weeks. One day, near the end of 7th period, Mrs. Granger asked Nick to come talk to her after school. "This is not detention, Nicholas. I just want to talk." Nick was excited. It was kind of like a conference during a war. One side waves a white flag and the generals come out and talk. General Nicholas Allen. Nick liked the sound of that. He stuck his head in Mrs. Granger's doorway after school. "You wanted to talk with me?" "Yes, Nicholas. Please come in and sit down." When he was settled, she looked at him and said, "Don't you think this Frindle business has gone far enough? It's just a disruption to the school, don't you think?" Shh. Nick swallowed hard, but he said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just fun, and it really is a real word. It's not a bad word, just different. And besides, it's how words really change, isn't it? That's what you said." Mrs. Granger sighed. "It is how a word could be made up brand new, I suppose. But the word pen, should it really be replaced by that other word? The word pen has a long, rich history. It comes from the Latin word for feather, pinna. It started to become our word pen because quills made from feathers were some of the first writing tools ever made. It's a word that comes from somewhere. It makes sense, Nicholas." "But Frindle makes just as much sense to me," said Nick. "And after all, didn't somebody just make up the word pinna, too?" That got a spark from Mrs. Granger's eyes, but all she said was, "Then you are not going to stop this?" And Nick looked her right in the eyes and said, "Well, a bunch of my friends and I took an oath about using the word, and we have to keep our promise. And besides, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I like my word." Nick tried to look brave, like a good general should. "Very well, then. I thought it would end up this way." Mrs. Granger pulled a fat white envelope from her desk drawer and held it up. This is a letter I have written to you, Nicholas. Nick held out his hand, thinking she was going to give it to him, but she didn't. I am not going to send it to you until all this is over. I want you to sign your name and put today's date across the back of the envelope. When you read it, whenever that may be, you will know it is the same letter and that I have not made any changes to it. This is weird, Nick said to himself. But to Mrs. Granger, he said, sure, and he signed his name in his best cursive and put the date under it. Then Mrs. Granger stood up abruptly and said, then that is all for today, Nicholas, and made the best word when. There was a frown on her face, but her eyes were different, almost happy. And Nick was halfway down the hall before it hit him. She likes this war, and she wants to win real bad. Walking to school the next day, Pete had a great idea. How about we see if we can get every kid in the whole 5th grade to go up and ask Mrs. Granger, can I borrow a Frindle? You mean, Mrs. Granger, may I borrow a Frindle, said Dave. Gotta use good grammar. Don't want to upset Dangerous Grangerous. They've got a lot of good nicknames for her. Sounds good to me, said Nick. She can't keep everyone after school, can she? Almost 80 kids stayed after school with Mrs. Granger that day. They filled her room and spilled out into the hallway. The principal had to stay late to help, and they had to arrange 2 special late buses to get all the kids home. And the next day, all the 5th graders did it again. And so did a lot of other students, over 200 students. Parents called to complain. The school bus drivers threatened to go on strike, and then the school board and the superintendent got involved. And about this time, the principal of Lincoln Elementary School paid a little visit to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Allen. That would be Nick's parents. She wanted to talk to them about their son, the one in 5th grade, the one named Nick. Last chapter today, chapter 9, called Chess. Chapter 9, Chess. Mrs. Margaret Chatham had been principal at Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chatham had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. Good evening, Nick, she said. No smile. Hi, Mrs. Chatham, said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would have played linebacker on a football team because that's what his dad had played in college. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it into her left pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chatham across the low coffee table. This is not an easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it. Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chatham laid out the story as she saw it. Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined 5th grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school, with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chatham talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chatham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. But doesn't all this seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly? Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, "Hurrah for Mom everywhere!" His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chatham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. I mean, is there really any harm in the children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used? Mrs. Chatham sighed and said, Yes, I suppose it does seem silly. But Mrs. Granger thinks that it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself. It's the lack of respect for authority. Mr. Allen said, Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we? And that's when Nick piped in. You know that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said that her big dictionary was the law. Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched a first-class thought grenade. Well, yes, but, well, as I said, the word ain't and even the word Frindle, these are not the real issue here, said Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Allen said, well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction, don't you think so, Tom? And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face to face. He was lost. Yes, well, sure, I guess so. I mean, it's not like anybody's been hurt. It's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that. His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Mrs. Chatham. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was a chess game. Nick against Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger had just tried to end the game by using her queen. Mrs. Chatham in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own, good old Mom, the White Queen. And the game was not over. It would go on until there was a winner and a loser. Mrs. Chatham didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have a right to explore new ideas, about the importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, about everybody needing to keep up the standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chatham some coffee and banana bread, but she said, no thanks, I really must be going now. She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, good night, Mrs. Chatham. Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. Nick, I think we'd better talk a little more about this, said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. If I find out that you have been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger or any other teacher at school, then you really will be in big trouble. I haven't been disrespectful, honest. I did get everybody started using my word, but like you said, it's not hurting anybody. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everybody to ask Mrs. Granger to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word once. All the kids like to use my word. It's just fun, that's all. Well, said Nick's dad, if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it must not be fun for everybody, is it? And I think you should just tell all your friends to knock it off. Right now. I mean, tomorrow. Nick shook his head. I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to be just mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't. And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if that idea was sinking in. It was. Like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my word. And I guess now we're just going to have to see what happens. And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree. The game would go on. All right, we will see you tomorrow.